Definitely start introducing our speakers. Tushar, are we recording the meeting? Please.
Yes, ma'am, we are recording it.
Once Nikita starts speaking, you can start recording. Hai na? Vijit, you know. Good, good. You'll be speaking to psychologists more today, but it's also an opportunity for psychologists to listen to you and interact with you. Professor Tripathi, of course, is one of our regular speakers. So, but I am also keen to hear him on this theme. Nikita, we can start now, na?
Okay. Good evening, everyone. I welcome you all to the webinar on reflexive pedagogy at the time of COVID pandemic to celebrate the International Day of Education, which is on 24th January. Now, to speak on the topic, we have two speakers with us, Professor Abhijit Pathak and Professor R.C. Tripathi, and Professor Miniti Panda will be chairing the talk. It is an honor to introduce the two speakers. They are the teachers who are loved by their students. Now, Professor Abhijit Pathak was formerly teaching at Center for the Study of Social Systems and has recently retired in December. He works in the area of sociology of education, social theory, sociology of modernization. He has taught for over 30 years, written extensively and reflexively, and actually still writes on the issues related to education, drawing from his experiences of being a teacher. He has also written on classroom pedagogical processes and student-teacher relations. His journey as a teacher has been of constant struggle in quest for becoming a better teacher every day, and how to create democratic and dialogical space for students in the classroom. And I can say this personally because I have done a case study on him in my MPhil dissertation on reflexive teaching. And I got a chance to enter into the life story of a man who practiced reflexive pedagogy and where he tries to move away from individual-centric narrow focus of reflective account to a relationally oriented intersubjective space. And how does he do that? I think it is the struggle with himself and the struggle with the questions like, who am I as a teacher? What I do as a teacher? So you can see him struggling and constantly questioning the limitations of knowledge put by his social position, be it coming from his caste, class, religion, ethnicity, his disciplinary training, and intellectual biases in a relational space of teacher and students in the classroom. So this is it is this ability to understand his as well as his students' context that makes him a reflexive teacher. I would say it is not an overnight process. It's not an overnight thing that a teacher becomes reflexive suddenly, but it's a constant process of becoming. You know, this constant struggle is what keeps a teacher, reflect on his teaching practice. So, cutting it short, I welcome you, sir, and now moving on to the next speaker, Professor R.C. Tripathi. He is chief editor of journal Psychology and Developing Societies. He was former professor at Allahabad University. He was former director GB Pant Institute, Allahabad. And as the students say, he is a teacher who has never retired. So now coming to one of his students and my supervisor, Professor Miniti Panda. She is faculty at Zakir Hussain Center for Studies, and she is president and chair of Social Policy Committee now. She has worked in her areas of specialization include cognition, mathematics, culture, curriculum pedagogy, and tribal education. Now I would like to invite Professor Panda to kindly introduce the theme and begin the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikita. It's such a pleasure to have you introduce Professor Pathak as well as Professor Tripathi. As you rightly said, both are very popular teachers, very conceptually oriented. They believe in creating disruptions in whatever knowledge they deal with, even when they engage with students or concepts. What makes them unique is their ability to question, to engage with themselves, and also constantly reflect on almost everything, even teaching, as well as their lives, their interactions, their students. In fact, it's a pleasure to have both of them on board to speak on reflexivity. And there's also a time when we witness a series of disruptions in the lives of children and students, both in school and higher education, because of this pandemic, as well as because of the current political and economic dispensation. So I think Professor Pathak will introduce himself through his own talk, as well as Professor Tripathi. I just want to say one sentence about Professor Pathak before I invite him to speak. That is, he's a poet, a thinker, and truly an academic heretic. And I love when he, by training, I was more a critical scholar, trained in Vygotsky tradition and a keen reader of dialectic theory. And so I had a huge proclivity for this particular term, critical scholarship, critical pedagogy. And I took time to move effortlessly between this critical and reflexive. Of course, Vygotsky talk about reflexive pedagogy, but my introduction to both these work in 2008 brought me closer to reflexive pedagogy. And I was also delighted to find Nikita's interest aligning, in this, aligning with this area. And she also rightly picked up Professor Pathak to study in detail. And she undertook a biographical narrative of Professor Pathak. Her entire MPhil work is actually on that. So I'm really, really delighted that Professor Pathak and Professor Tripathi today are on board, and I am happy to welcome you both to this webinar. Instead of coming between our speakers and the audience, let me invite Professor Pathak to start the talk. As discussed, Professor Pathak, you may be speaking for 40 minutes. And Professor Tripathi was, wanting to be a little brief. So he may take 15 to 20 minutes to present his views. And then we will invite comments or questions. So Professor Pathak, over to you. Professor Pathak, are you on board?
Yeah. Is it okay? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Now, thank you, Minuti and Nikita, for making it possible, giving me an opportunity to be here. And it's a great honor. And as I see, the audience, leading educators, educationists, and psychologists are here. And I do not know, these great scholars, educationists, and psychologists, whether I would be able to make sense in front of you. Technically, and as far as the academic division of labor goes, and the way our modern university system erects walls of separation, School of Physical Sciences here, School of Social Sciences in another building, political science in the first floor, sociology in the ground floor. So there is so much of a separation and such acute specialization in the academic division of labor. So in that sense of the university terminology, I have got nothing to do with psychology as a specialized discipline. But the beauty of life is that life often refuses to go on through the logic through which universities build up departments and think of specialization and segmentation of knowledge. As a college student in the mid and late 70s, growing up at a time when all sorts of political, cultural, ethical, moral issues were confronting us, and a time of being young, and at that time trying to make sense of the world. And in order to make sense of the world, psychology came to me not through conventional academics, but in many ways, to understand the self, to understand politics, to understand the world around us. So in a way, I entered the domain of psychology, if you use the term, and the intricacy of human emotions, human consciousness, human psychology, say, for example, through a series of existentialist literature. I do not know how many times I have read Dostoevsky's The Karamazov Brothers, how many times I have read Albert Camus and Sartre. So a lot of existentialist literature that invariably took us to the deeper domain of human emotions, the questions of meaning, existence, psychic pain, trauma, anxiety, absurdity, meaninglessness, and the mode of living. These are the questions that we often confronted through a lot of this literature. And it was also very difficult to be indifferent to the kind of changes which were taking place because of certain kind of engagement between the Marxists and the Freudians and the psychoanalysts. As a result, people like Herbert Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man, Eros and Civilization, and Erich Fromm, they came in a big way in our consciousness. Erich Fromm's very slim, beautiful book, Beyond the Chains of Illusions, My Encounter with Freud and Marx, or the Erich Fromm's the book on the Escape from Freedom or the Art of Loving, and Herbert Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man, Eros and Civilization, things of that kind. So we were trying to make sense of that, how Freudians and the Marxists were talking, and a new notion of the self that and society relationship was coming and emerging. So existentialist literature, Sigmund Freud, Marx, Erich Fromm, Herbert Marcuse, the New Left, and also the writings of people like R.D. Laing and others on self and society, the divided self, the fragmented self. So in a way, although technically and professionally I was doing sociology, but through literature, through philosophy, through this kind of reading, my interest in human emotions and my interest in the deeper questions relating to the meaning of existence, relating to pain, trauma, anxiety, and the human emotions got sharpened. And I believe that as a learner, you and I are essentially seeker and the wanderer. Yes, as part of the institutionalized formal academic systems, we are part of certain kind of specialized body of knowledge and the discipline. But if we dare to see ourselves beyond that roles, then possibly we find ourselves as perpetual learners and eternal seekers, constantly wandering, exploring, inquiring, transcending the boundaries and entering the domain of the unknown, inexplicable. And that is the way I begin to see myself as a lifelong student, as a wanderer. So I do not know where sociology has ended, philosophy has entered, where philosophy has ended, psychology has entered, and where literature has come. So I often imagine myself that one day I come to my classroom. On the one hand, a book, Sigmund Freud's Civilization and its Discontent. In another hand, Karl Marx's economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844. And then in the pocket, anthropologist Nirmal Kumar Bose's book, My Days with Gandhi, Gandhi's Noakhali Days, and Nirmal Kumar Bose was writing in detail about those turbulent times and Gandhi's journey. Now, and another book on Shadat Hassan Manto's path-breaking stories on partition violence. So things of that kind, this plurality, this spirit of being a wanderer, this constant urge, to overcome the boundaries, the fluidity, that I have always cherished and I have loved and I have believed in that. So with this, very brief introduction, that's why I'm excited that in front of me, there are educationists, there are psychologists, and although I'm not from the psychology discipline, but for me, it's a great opportunity to learn from all of you. So with this introduction, let me, as I was talking to Minoti, and we're thinking about reflecting on reflexive pedagogy at the time of the pandemic. So coming to that theme, there are essentially 3 points, because time is limited, 3 points that I wish to stress, and logically and coherently and quickly. And then if you have certain queries and questions, you would reflect on that and I would try to respond. The first is about the notion of self and reflexivity, which I have always tried to reflect on, both as a student and as a teacher. And it is here, there are 2 sources, 2 foundations from where I have drawn certain important lessons of self and reflexivity. One is from the political domain, the domain of politics. And when I think of the domain of politics, I believe that one of the distinctive features of Gandhi's entry into the politico-ethical and the politico-spiritual realm is that Gandhi brought the question of the self and reflexivity in a remarkably grand way in the domain of politics. In other words, and even in his urge to decolonize the consciousness and to fight for freedom. So the enemy is not just out there. The enemy also lies deep inside. I cannot fight the violence of colonialism. I cannot fight the greed of colonialism. I cannot fight the exploitative and instrumental rationality of colonialism unless I fight my own greed, fight my own violence. And as a result, constant scrutiny of the self. Who am I? What is my desire? What is my greed? Is there violence inside my consciousness? Gandhi throughout sought to experiment with the self. And this experimentation with the self was deeply related to his experimentation with politics. As a result, politics is not merely replacing the white rule by the brown rule. Politics is also a kind of self-quest, a self-actualization, and the self-discovery. And that's why the importance that he attached to the self and the ethics and the moral and the way a Shatyagrahi or someone who is engaged in an act of nonviolent resistance ought to continually undergo a process of self-purification and self-actualization, that became a very important component of Gandhi's politics. So the way he brought the notion of the self and the constant scrutiny of the self and the reflexivity, that I think was a very important lesson that I wanted to negotiate with. And second, as we began to study sociology and social sciences, and particularly the philosophy of social sciences and the methodological question, then in the American social science, in the post-Talcott-Parsonian world, the arrival of people like C. Wright Mills and the Alvin W. Goldner, during the time of the war, the Vietnam War and others, the way Goldner particularly brought the issue of reflexivity in social sciences, in sociology. So he would critique the positivistic objectification of the world. He would see the limits to scientificism and the positivistic objectification of the world. And he would also attach great importance to the question of reflexivity and self. As he would argue, I cannot know the world out there unless I also look at myself, know myself. And I cannot know myself. I cannot make sense of my being unless I understand the world out there. So in history, I see my biography. And in my own biography, I see all the drama of history unfolding itself. I am not separated from history, and history is not separated from me. In other words, in order to understand the world out there, human society, its culture, politics, movement, history, I ought to also look at myself. I also look at myself, and I understand myself better only when I also understand the society, my time, my history. In a different way, C. Wright Mills would have said it, a certain kind of a sociological imagination that enables me to translate my private troubles into the public issues. So it's like a rhythmic bridge between the self and the world, between the subjectivity and the objectivity, between the personal and the political, between the biographical and the historical. And I think that's a very refreshing language as opposed to Baconian empiricism and Cartesian body-mind dualism, and it came with a fresh language, a new way of looking at knowledge and our orientation to knowledge as seekers, as students, as wanderers. So from Gandhi, as in the domain of politics, as well as people like Goldman and C. Wright Mills, we learned a great lesson of self and reflexivity in the life of the studentship, in the life of a seeker, a wanderer. The second point that I wish to argue is that, and which I wish to stress, and with some degree of intensity and conviction, I think that when you join this vocation of teaching, and when you join the vocation of teaching, I think that one of the most important things, and which I have realized in the process of teaching for 31 years at this university, that we ought to understand, and we must understand, that teaching is a vocation of a qualitatively different kind. And it's a vocation of a qualitatively different kind. When I say it, I say that what is the self-perception of the teaching community? What ought to be the self-perception of the teaching community? Unfortunately, we live in a world where techno-managers, the academic bureaucrats, and the neoliberal market-driven instrumental reasoning seem to have reduced teachers into mere service providers or into mere mediators between the official curriculum and students. And a teacher, for all practical purposes, has been reduced into a tape recorder who would just repeat the scriptures which have been codified in the official curriculum or in the select text. And the teacher is just a data provider who would conduct exam, grade, rank, hierarchize students, and supply this data to the academic bureaucracy or to the higher authorities. And I believe that this perception, this very narrow, bureaucratically defined role of the teacher is just a tape recorder, covering the syllabus, repeating the scriptures codified in the official curriculum, conducting exams, grading, ranking, hierarchizing students. It's a very narrow, limiting, oppressive idea of being a teacher. Anyone who loves this vocation, who celebrates this vocation, would feel restless if one is confined to that role. And it is in that context, I believe, that a teacher's movement, a teacher's awakening, where it is absolutely important for us to rise up and to say that we are not cogs in a bureaucratic machine. Academic bureaucrats, techno managers, the market would try its best to reduce us into the role of either service providers or just mediators between the curriculum and the students and the data providing missions. But we are essentially co-travelers, wanderers, dialogic teachers, continually learning, unlearning, and working with young learners and students and trying to collectively problematize the world, make sense of the world, define and redefine the world. In other words, you could use, and it is here, just I would speak of 3 sources of inspiration that did inspire me in this journey to redefine me as a teacher and constantly question a very narrow, officially bureaucratic definition of the role of the teacher. One is, of course, much talked about Paulo Freire. When Freire talks about the pedagogy of hope, or Paulo Freire talks about dialogue, that dialogue where teacher and the student are constantly conversing with each other as co-travelers, trying to problematize the world, creating a problem-posing education, and young learners, apart from being as the passive receivers of knowledge as a product, are active creators of knowledge, and together with the teacher and the student together are defining, redefining the world and creating the world. And it is based on that primary hope that every learner is a potential, every learner is a possibility, and it is important in the act of teaching to tap that potential and to collectively explore, learn, and unlearn the world. So critical pedagogy and the dialogue that Paulo Freire gave us and argued very powerfully, and that critical pedagogy, dialogic education eventually led to the pedagogy of hope that Freire talked about. And then Paulo Freire's another disciple, whom we lost very recently, Bell Hooks, the way in top American universities should bring the experiential domain of young learners and students in the classroom. Imagine Teaching to Transgress, in one of his fantastic books, she is narrating an experience in a male white dominated classroom in an American university. A Black woman feel hesitant to articulate her pain in a Black accent. But it is only in Bell Hooks' class, it is only in Bell Hooks' classroom that girl one day would gain the confidence. And she would cry, she would narrate her experience, her trauma and pain. And after the class, as Bell Hooks described, she came, she hugged her professor, Bell Hooks, eye to eye, body to body, as Bell Hooks said. And this girl is saying that for the first time, I have acquired my voice. I have acquired my language. I could articulate myself. I could make my point. And classroom can become an experience of healing, And something that Bell Hooks was talking about, Teaching to Transgress, all about love, the book that Bell Hooks wrote, from Teaching to Transgress and all about love, there is a correlation that communication, dialogue, experience, and teachers as communicators, as healers, not just someone who is just completing the syllabus and grading and ranking and hierarchizing the students. So Paulo Freire, Bell Hooks, they were, for example, to take that illustration, but the great foundations that in a way helped me and possibly many to, perpetually love this vocation and to constantly interrogate and question the very techno-bureaucratic role of being a teacher, merely as a data provider and someone who only conduct exams and the great students, And it is in that context, I believe, that another person, who was of great influence was, of course, the famous speech that Jiddu Krishnamurti delivered when he came out of Anibasant and Theosophical Society and realized that no organized sect, no organized religion, no institutionalized dogma could take us nearer to the truth. And the speech that he delivered, truth is a pathless land, So it's a constant wandering. And that's why it is so important to see beyond the prescribed fixed notion of organized religion and the organized body and the fixed dogma, and to be non-reductionist, to be a perpetual wanderer, to a perpetual explorer. And learning is impossible without the spirit of being a wanderer, a perpetual wanderer. A teacher or a student ceases to be a teacher or a student the day she or he has stopped to be a wanderer. So I often share a joke with many of my Marxist colleagues that it would be really unfortunate that you are born as a Marxist and you die as a Marxist, and as if in between nothing has happened in your life, that would make you also ask new kind of questions that maybe Marxism could not provide an answer to that. That would be a certain kind of a reductionism, the dogma of certainty. You refuse to be lost in a pathless land. But if you are a teacher, you should acquire the courage to be lost in a pathless land. And that, I believe, is one of the important things, which is very important about the self-perception of the teaching community. And the third, which is, I think, very important, particularly in the context of today's theme, that when for last 2 years, the pandemic happened, then what were we doing as teachers? This is a question that perpetually confronts me and makes me sleepless. And see, for example, the way, once again, the poverty of imagination and the way our techno managers who run our schools, colleges, and the universities, the way they responded to that issue. And I have no hesitation in saying, in that response, you see the poverty of imagination, because they thought that this could be handled only through technology. So it's merely a technical question. So till yesterday, students and teachers were meeting in a physically embedded classroom and the face-to-face interaction. And now there is a pandemic. The only thing that you and I have to do, just overnight, we have to shift to the online mode. So now we were told that keep doing the same thing, cover the same syllabus, take the same exam, give the same kind of lecture, and grade the students in the same way, which you used to do earlier. Only difference is that this time you would do it online. As if nothing else has happened in the world. Nothing else has changed. And we are only told that we have to carry the same syllabus, conduct the same exam, do the same job. Only we have to become now techno-smart, techno-efficient. We have to do it online. This, I believe, is a very, very shallow, superficial response to the time, to the crisis we confronted. And why I say this, and I say it with great pain, emotion, and conviction, because if not teachers, if not students, if not educators, reflect on the crisis and redefine education at the time of the pandemic, who else would do? Zoom would not do it. Google Meet would not do it. It is you and me as teachers, as communicators, as students, as seekers, wanderers, we have to engage into that question. And that question is a deeper question. And the academic bureaucrats and the techno managers refuse to respond to that question because of the poverty of imagination, their instrumental thinking. Now, why I'm saying that if we reflect on the pandemic deeply, then I think that First thing it has done to us that, you know what phenomenologists often say, that the world that we otherwise take for granted, our everyday normal world, you are alive, I am alive, tomorrow at 9 we'll come to the classroom and talk to each other. The world that you and I take for granted. In the month of March, there would be a mid-semester exam. In the month of June, there would be an end-sem exam. That taken for granted world. Or at 7:30, I would take the metro from the Hotchkiss metro station. And at 8:45, I would reach Delhi University metro and I would come to my college. And my routine would go on like this. That taken for granted world, which we take for granted, that world completely crumbled. That world completely lost. And when the taken for granted world collapsed, crumbled, we entered into the realm of uncertainty. We entered into the realm of uncertainty and think that the way we grow up in the modern age, the age of technoscience, the age of predictability, and the modernist search for certainty, that age never trained us how to cope with the domain of uncertainty. Buddha knew about it. Things are temporal. Things are uncertain. Nothing is stable. Nothing is fixed. Everything is altering, changing. But we were never sensitive to that. Our modern education has never taught us that. Now the pandemic suddenly took us to that world of utter uncertainty. Our taken for granted world completely collapsed and crumbled. We entered into that domain of uncertainty. And imagine the second wave in a city like Delhi and Bombay. Morning, you get the news of the death of a student. In the evening, you get the news of the death of a colleague. And that's the way we were living. And next morning, you do not know whether you were alive or whether you were running around from hospital to hospital without any guarantee that whether you would get the oxygen cylinder. Now, we were living at a time of this kind. We all passed through that, experienced that. Now, this uncertainty, when we experience in such a big way, then I think that one of the important questions that ought to confront you and me about rethinking some of the assumptions about our time, the assumptions that techno-capitalists and the techno-modernists want us to believe, that everything could be controlled, everything could be predicted, and life could go on like this with our techno-economic urge of control and domination. You know, that world began to collapse and crumble. And is it the time to redefine ourselves from proud conquerors to humble wanderers? Isn't it the fact that pandemic was asking this question again and again, that are we proud conquerors? You know, the way Francis Bacon asked, knowledge is power. Descartes told that I think and therefore I exist. The way the technoscience wanted us to go on with unlimited greed and the desire and the violence. Is it the time for a pause, to be silent, to be reflexive, to think that we are not the proud conquerors. We are like dust particles. We are just humble wanderers. The second is that about the death. Now, when the bodies are thrown into the river, and when we see the chaotic crematoriums, you know, and when we only see the number, and it is remains statistic so long as it has not come to my house, to my home. The moment it comes to my home, it is not statistics, it is something else. And the trivialization of death. Now, how we make sense of death, how we make sense of death, and are we ever Did our education ever make us sensitive, even in a psychology class, that how we make sense of living and dying and the death? I do not know. A young student doesn't know that whether he would become an IIT engineer or a chartered accountant. But one thing we all know, that he would die. But have we ever talked about death in our classrooms? Have we ever discussed about living and dying in our classrooms? Have we ever asked our students to reflect on the last conversation between Gautam Buddha and Ananda? Then when Buddha was dying and Ananda was crying, and Buddha was saying that, Ananda, you have been with me for more than 3 decades, but don't you know that all that is phenomenal and temporal is bound to wither away? Now, did we ever talk about it? Now, these were the things which were coming. But what we were doing, we were asked by the academic bureaucrats, teach the same syllabus, conduct the same kind of exam, and keep grading your students. One night before the end semester exam, I got a message from one of my students from Assam. My mother is COVID positive, my father is COVID positive, struggling in a hospital with the ventilation support. What do we do? What do I do? Academic bureaucrats, do they have an answer to that question? Now, this is where I think that it was a time when it needed a different kind of engagement between the teachers and the students. The engagement that should have been based on which, the Vietnamese Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh would argue, mindfulness and the art of compassionate listening. The art of compassionate listening and mindfulness. And it was not surprising that Bell Hooks was equally influenced by Eric Fromm, Paulo Freire, and Thich Nhat Hanh, the engaged Buddhism, the engaged pedagogy, Now, I think that the compassionate art of listening, teachers as listeners, teachers as healers, teachers as reflexive seekers, working with students, engaging with students. We talk about learning laws. Nothing would happen if a child last year has not learned how to draw the area of a trapezium. But there could have been a learning gain had she found a teacher who could have told at that time what it meant to be a migrant worker and walking from Surat to an unknown village in Bihar, only with the hope that if I die there would be someone who would be with me, but in an unknown anonymous city that might give me money, but that won't give me the dignity. What it meant about that journey, that is outside syllabus, beyond the syllabus, possibly there could have become certain learning gain. See this very word, learning loss. The world is collapsing and we are bothered whether a 3-year-old baby in a fancy international school in Bangalore on online classes is learning the perfect technique of drawing the sun rising beneath the hill. And for 2 hours, the 3-year-old sitting in front of the camera on the laptop and learning how to draw the sun coming out of the hills. Or the child is being asked to draw the area of a trapezium. And my student's father is in the hospital and I am asking her to write an essay on Emil Durkheim's 4 types of suicide. This is absurd. This is meaningless. This is violence. And this we have been doing. And I believe that it is time that as teachers we rise up, we stand up, and we believe that we need real restructuring of our role, of our engagement with students and learners. And this is where a blend of sociology, psychology, engaged religiosity, liberating pedagogy, and the philosophy would help us to create a new self-perception of the teaching community and a meaningful reflexive emancipatory engagement between the teacher and the student. I'll just end my conversation with a poem, which only the other day I read it many times. It's from a great poet from Bangladesh, Slomo. Is one of the, I'm very bad in translation, but it's like this, its essence is like this. For years, I'm searching my poem. I have not yet found my poem. In search of my poem, one day, I approached an old lady with wrinkled face. And that lady told me that if you could understand that what this every fold of this wrinkled face indicates, you would not get your poetry. For ages, I am searching my poem. I approach a broken wall, and the broken wall whispers in my ears and tells me, you would find your poem if you understand the pain of every dust particle in that wall. And then I approach a tree, and the tree tells me that you would understand my poem if you go deep, deep into my roots, and in midnight, you understand why the tree is crying. And for ages, I'm searching my poem. Now, I think that is the journey of a seeker, of a wanderer, of a teacher. And after 31 years of teaching, I often realize that I have only undertaken a journey. I am like that poet. I am only approaching a broken wall, an old tree, and an woman with a wrinkled face. And that's the journey. And this journey has its own beauty, has its own depth, has its own poetry. And this journey, UGC cannot measure. This journey, academic bureaucrats would not understand. This journey is immeasurable, and all that is valuable in life is immeasurable. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Vijay Pathak, thanks a lot. I always saw a poet, a thinker, and an academic, heretic in you. And your speech actually proves that. I remember in last April, when we went through the second phase of pandemic, and some of our students, we decided to meet in Zakir Hussain Center. We realized that, there is a complete temporal collapse. The time was collapsing, the psychological spaces were collapsing, and every space was ruptured. So we didn't know how to talk to each other. Nikita, I don't know whether she'll be able to ever say that she lost her father during that time. And we just didn't know how to talk to Nikita, how to, and forget about PhD. We just didn't know how to establish a kind of conversation with, each other. It's not about student and teacher only, it's just about with each other. And the second realization what many of us had is that, teachers have a very unique position, because whatever may be the time, the parents actually teach us a lot. They leave their children in schools. You can see children are allowed to still spend few hours with teachers. The mother passes on this child to a teacher. So, a huge responsibility lies in us. And we all know that as long as inequalities exist, the classroom pedagogy, perpetuates a kind of pedagogy of a predatory culture, actually. It perpetuates a kind of pedagogy of violence we practice. So it's teachers' job to, make the classroom livable, realizable, and, psychologically also, psychologically realizable, and also make us human. And I'm so glad that, we actually invited you to speak on this International Day of Education, because we wanted to be reminded of how we are turned into instruments of oppression and violence in this, very state. Being teachers, we also don't realize that how we commit violence on a regular basis in the classroom by not being able to reflect on our own actions, lives, the state, the children's life, and also engage with our own actions, I would say. Thank you, Professor Pathak, for being so poetic and elegantly prosaic at the same time. I now invite Professor Ramacharan Tripathi, who is another very, very reflexive thinker and very, very conceptually oriented, and who actually, whenever I've heard him, I found him engaging with lives through pedagogy. So his pedagogy is of, talking about people's everyday life, about his own life. And concepts are obviously tools for him. So I invite Professor Tripathi to express his views on this auspicious day.
Miniti, I was wondering whether there would be people who would like to dialogue with Professor Pathak at this stage. Because once I speak, then I'll be speaking in another direction. So if you're talking about dialoguing, I think probably now is the time. You should invite maybe people who have want to comment and has a question or whatever. But then I think you, being the chair, you the person who needs to decide, and Professor Pathak.
Well, I see a logic in what you are saying. So shall we spend 15, 20 minutes, maybe 20 minutes, so that Professor Tripathi also gets time to speak and take questions. Professor Pathak, would you like to take some questions, or even, if
Yes,
their experiences of a teacher's life or life?
Yes.
And also at a time that is so disruptive in all possible senses. So maybe next 20 minutes we spend on interaction with Professor Pathak. So the floor is open. Please, you can ask questions. You can also share your own observations or experiences. Please switch on your video and audio if you want to ask.
May I start, ma'am? Sunita Mishra.
Yes, Sunita. Sunita, you can switch on your video also. it will be a little more interesting for everybody. Sunita.
Hello, sir. Thank you so much for this beautiful journey. I have been listening to parts of your lectures, but I think this is the first time I have heard it full. And I, being a teacher at undergrad, I teach undergrad students in a Delhi University college. From your talk, I completely agree, but at the same time, I also feel that teachers are always they are situated in a system. As an individual teacher, howsoever empathetic I am with my students, and I try to in my classroom, but how do I catch up with the system's requirements and demands from me as a teacher? So, for example, in my class, if I go and like nowadays my students are always complaining that one after the other we have so many online classes, हमारे सर में दर्द हो जाता है और बहुत प्रॉब्लम होती है. तो I am compassionate with them. I tell them, okay, whenever you need a break, tell me, or we can start 15 minutes late. We can also leave 15 minutes early, half an hour early, etc. I mean, whatever way I can be compassionate with them. But the requirement of this system from me as a teacher to conduct all these things as a body, just as a body, how do I cope with that? I mean, I think everybody is talking about what the teacher can do. But being situated in a particular kind of a system which puts all the pressure, all the stress, all the demands on the teacher, how do we cope with that?
Now, thank you, Shumita. I think that this is a very genuine concern and a genuine question. And I entirely agree with you. What I was trying to say is that that it is not that as an individual situated amid certain kind of structural constraints, we could do everything. But I believe that what is important for all of us as part of the teaching community, to constantly articulate these concerns again and again, and to articulate our voices, and also, for example, what I would call art of possibilities. And this is where I would talk about, what social scientists often talk about structuration. That we know that there is a structure, and the structure at times is very constraining. But amid that constraining structures, you and I have certain kind of a creative surplus and the creative agency. And I think that it is like this dialectical interplay between the structure and our creative agency that leads to certain process of structuration. You are not outside the structure, and at the same time, you are not just a puppet of the structure. Now, it is that activation of your creative surplus that makes it possible. I think that I would just end it with an illustration that suppose I say that space inch miracle me to every. It doesn't make any sense because these words are discrete and it is not governed by certain structure of the grammar. Now, someone came and said, to me, every inch of space is a miracle. It is a grammatically perfect sentence, but it is not just grammatically perfect sentence. Hardly a sentence of this kind is written. And you needed a Walt Whitman to write that. To me, every inch of space is a miracle. So what was this? Walt Whitman wrote not merely a grammatically correct sentence. Walt Whitman did something extra into it. And that was his poetic surplus. So I think that when you are truly a concerned teacher, even in those 60 minutes, there are 10 minutes are with you. 50 minutes you complete the syllabus. 50 minutes, even you can assure them you would get an A grade. But 10 minutes are with you. And never undermine those 10 minutes. Never underestimate the potential of those 10 minutes. And when you begin to do it, you see the art of possibility. You see the art of possibility. That's the choice that each of us has to take, that choice that nobody can tell. Nobody can dictate which choice an individual teacher would take, So don't give up so early. You are young, energetic. Don't give up so early. We survived 31 years, and you are much more energetic. Why such a language of despair? Yes.
That is what colleges do to our teachers, Vijit. They instrumentalize the body as well as their language to an extent that they experience failure, before they really face it.
Yes.
It's
true.
They experience already. Shivani, you want to say something?
Yeah. No, I was just about to share that, how Professor Pathak articulated, this was a beautiful response. And I was also thinking, because we've heard a lot of colleagues share this despair. But this, one wonders whether this despair, of course, comes from the way structures are. But here also, is it possible for us as teachers to look within and see how we are locating our roles, in response to these structures? We have also, agreed to become some, tools or even smoke screens for these structures. How ready are we to be vulnerable, to not have answers in front of our students, rather than uh, coming out with a very neat picture to them. So how, unless and until we are able to ask questions and identify the problems, how do we encourage the students to problematize? So sometimes while interacting with colleagues, I also feel that for us, the idea of critical thinking, of problematizing, of answering, of raising questions is something we want students to do. But we do struggle to do it ourselves. And here also, somewhere it would be useful for us to engage more and move beyond becoming very individualized individuals, something that pandemic also seems to have done. This physical distance somehow has also become a distance that creates a barrier between empathy and, intellectually relating. So for us to come together as a community of teachers, to be asking questions consistently, and at least not become voices of the admins, I feel is also something that we should be able to retain, no matter how difficult. If we look so in despair, where do we create space for hope and criticality in our classrooms? So yeah, just that's one thing that I also wanted to share. I mean,
Thank you, Shivani. Safe. Let me just.
Thank you, Shivani. I think it's a wonderful point you have made, and that is where, when such bright young teachers like you, it is now when you carry that lamp, and that possibility, that art of possibility, and the pedagogy of hope, and that I think is so, assuring, to listen to you, and thank you for articulating it so beautifully and strongly.
I see Saif and Susmita raising hands. Shall we start with Saif? Because I saw his, he raised probably his hands before Susmita. Saif, switch on your video as well.
Professor Pathak, I'm glad to be interacting with you. I've been reading your articles for many years, and this is the first time I'm actually having communication with you. So this is very a pleasurable moment for me. I just want to share an observation that I've had, and I would like you to comment on it and also correct me if I'm wrong in my observation. Over the years, I've been seeing teaching moving towards a very impersonal direction, in the sense that I'm someone, and obviously we all would agree with that teaching is a very personal communication with students that we have in the classroom. It's much beyond the syllabus, like you very much said. It's not just about completing the syllabus within a particular time. But over the years, especially now that the pandemic is here, and there's a lot of emphasis on online education, online teaching, and also there's a lot of stress, or I would say pressure, on teachers accomplishing certain milestones in their career. And focusing on those milestones, as well as now giving more and more emphasis on online teaching, somewhere teaching is becoming more and more impersonal. That communication that we have with students somewhere is not happening, because teachers are focusing, or I would say rather made to focus on some other, in some other direction. I mean, I would just like to have your comment on this. Do you agree with me, or is it really that way that it's been happening?
Professor Pathak.
I absolutely understand and agree with Parak's concern, and I think just one point I would just add, while agreeing with him, to another point, that Another challenge to the vocation of teaching is coming today. I feel that a very pathological obsession with measurement and the numbers that characterizes the university bureaucracy and the UGC. And that's why I ended that all that is truly valuable is immeasurable. But now many young, bright people who join the vocation, come to the colleges and the universities, they join now with a chronic anxiety that how many papers in this year, how many seminars in this year, how many citation index and all that. And we all know that in a fundamentally corrupt society like ours, there is a huge racket going on, the publication industry, seminar industry, all these things go on. And a significant amount of time many young students spend on that who have just joined the vocation because the system forces them to do that. And it has been added by another false duality, which I believe absolutely false, is the teaching versus research. It's completely false because no meaningful research is possible unless there are active, vibrant classrooms. Researchers do not come from another planet. Researchers come from universities. If there are not good school teachers, if there are not good college teachers and the university teachers, there would not be good researcher. And teaching, meaningful, engaged teaching is impossible without research. It's a tremendously serious endeavor. It needs tremendous constant reflection. And that research need not necessarily always manifest itself in 6 articles in a year, 10 international conferences in a year, what I call the fetish of CV. And we all are victims of that today. That has caused great damage to that spirit, that a silent revolution in the classroom. And if silent revolution in the classroom doesn't take place, our democracy won't be alive. The health of democracy depends on the health of our classrooms, and that I believe is very important. As part of the teaching community, I just appeal to all of these young teachers, let's feel very proud of our vocation and the kind of thing that we could do, and with that, we should critique all that is happening in the name, what the UGC is doing today, reducing us into merely a number game, and that's the point I will just add.
Since we don't have much time, we'll just take last 2 questions from Susmita and Arjun in that order. I just want that we start Professor Tripathi's talk at 6:45, or at least 6:48, not later than that. Susmita and Arjun, just be very brief.
Very briefly, thank you.
I don't want to say take less time. I'm so sorry.
Yes. There is quickly one thing. I couldn't stop a reflection as I heard Professor Pathak. So I just want to share an experience of last year when, as you know, our department in NCERT runs this diploma course in guidance and counseling. So during the contact period of a practical class in the counseling, we were having our small group the skills of counseling, and therein one student, I hope I'm audible.
Yeah.
She couldn't focus upon for consecutive 2-3 classes, and because online, obviously face-to-face was not there, and you usually keep the video of bar come on the video so that we see the body language, facial expressions and everything. And as this was, she opened up later on. I'm just trying to share the experience that how students hide their emotions and their problems. Then she came up and said that, ma'am, mere ghar mein everyone is in isolation. I don't even know whether, and I'm very them engage with the activity of learning, active listening, which is something. This going
breaking.
Training is that as a teacher, we need to all the controlled in all and everything. And believe me, Professor Pathak, that was the time when I started reflecting within me as to who is the priority in that classroom, as a counseling faculty or as a human being reaching out to another human being. And it took me at least a couple of nights to deliberate with my own thoughts and dwell upon as to how to reach out to the students and say that, well, like you, even I am going through an emotional crisis. But when I could do that, along with her, there were all the class, all the group of going through. More than that, what I realized is that I have own tendencies and the duality between me as the human crisis.
Susmita,
probably I did the right thing.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. And this also makes me realize that in our teacher education, particularly at the school level, the teacher education needs probably to get more, open up about teachers' affective domains to get more into focus rather than only the pedagogy and the learning of how to teach the subject areas. Because without emotions, without understanding and exploring their own emotions and conveying and communicating in a more emotional language in the classroom, we will not be able to nurture human beings. We'll only nurture some cognitive aspect somewhere.
I entirely agree with you, Sushmita ji, because this affective, emotional, experiential element, and that's why this entire reflexivity and self is so important in the process of teaching and learning. I entirely agree with you.
Arjun, I think we'll take your question or comments now, and then after Professor Pathak responds, we'll listen to Professor Tripathi then. Arjun, are you there? Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Hello. Yeah, yes. Actually, my question is also from the school, the pedagogy. Actually, Smita ma'am has already asked the same kind of concern. So I just want to understand that the term itself, the pedagogy, and the kind of practices which are being followed in the name of pedagogy. Actually, the term pedagogy is more defined or more understood in the terms of school education, as there is no such as formal training for the teaching in university level or at a professor level. So this term more goes to the school level. So my concern is that the thing which are being done in the name of pedagogy at a school level, the kind of training school teachers, teacher educators are going through, and what is being taught to them, is really pathetic. The kind of practices they are going through in UP these days, you see in everywhere this new emerging teacher pedagogy institutions are mushrooming like anything. And this is my one concern. Another I mean that in such a scenario, how it is expected, or how one is expected to have the teachers or teacher educator who are humanistic, sympathetic and understanding. And my another concern is that in classroom itself, this your work itself, your writing itself are indicating, and I have also seen it by myself, that CCTV cameras and things like that are being put in the classroom, where that space, the fruit of freedom is not tasted by the students, and these same students are coming in the university. I mean, school teaching is going through a much worse time then and still I see a huge gap between university education and school education. So why there is a huge gap? The teachers are segregating themselves. Why they cannot be a bridge between school education and university education? Because ultimately university education is the product of school education, and their things are much worse. So say something, right?
I think there are 2 points, Arjun, very good points, which I understood and which I think must be reflected on. One is that the university school community interconnectedness relationships.
Yes.
And you are absolutely right in articulating the issue that university cannot be saved unless schools are saved. So I think that interconnectedness is absolutely important. And second, I think, which is, as you said, and that entire technologies of surveillance, which we see in our education institution, right from the CCTV camera to other modes of surveillance. And this American Canadian professor Henry Giro, who write so extensively on the neoliberalism assault on higher education and the education. And again, he would remind us of this, that the increasing, not only the entry of the instrumentality of the market into the domain of learning and seeing education merely as a product, a market-friendly product. And apart from that, the surveillance, the technologies of surveillance, and the controlling students and the teachers, the practice of learning and pedagogy. So I think that critical pedagogues like Henry Giro and others, they are again and again reminding us of the battle that your generation has to fight, to rescue education and move towards more libertarian pedagogy and meaningful emancipatory education. It's a long battle, it's a difficult struggle, but it's a battle that has to be fought.
Professor Pathak, just one small thing I would share with you, and then we can close this part of our webinar. When this pandemic started and we went through a lot of experiences that were, many of you have already shared, we thought that the teachers should develop a very special kind of sensitivity to listen to their students. So we probably need a pedagogy of listening than, just speaking and be heard by our students. And patriarchy has trained us, a very unidimensionality to this pedagogy of speaking and just be heard. Like I occupy this powerful position as a teacher. And I know that whatever I say, the students will listen. Whether they agree or they do not agree, they will still not ask. They will be there, they'll listen to me. So I thought we will we'll talk about pedagogy of listening. But when we talked about pedagogy of listening, we basically referred to a kind of relational space, which is also a space of power. There is power asymmetry, and how do we listen to each other? How do teachers listen to their students? How do students listen to each other? Even students have a hierarchy among themselves. A student coming from St. Stephen's and a student coming from a village in Odisha are very differently positioned in the classroom. But surprisingly, what we found that as we progressed with our engagement, we realized that a lot of publications are coming out on deep listening. And then, like scholars are, giving you 5 points, 10 points, the behavioral indicators of a good listener. So I realized every radical, or every, the sensitive dialogue is immediately instrumentalized and sold off as a pedagogic tool. So, the enemy that I have in this world of pedagogy is from within our community. Like there would be then 10 researchers or teachers who will come up with 10 ways of doing it best. So again, this is one small thing, but this is something we encountered, in May and June when we were working on pedagogy of listening. Yeah. And how do you handle that? This market takes over immediately, any good thing.
I agree with you completely, Minati. Just one point before Professor Tripathi takes over, that it is really ironic that in our colleges and universities quite often, even Paulo Freire's dialogic education would be taught in an utterly authoritarian, non-dialogic way. Habermas's theory of communicative interaction would be introduced in an utterly non-communicative way. So democracy would be taught by a very authoritarian teacher. So everything is its opposite, and that is where I think that the constant reflection and questioning, and teachers have to undergo that process of self-critique and self-reflection all the time. And thank you. I absolutely agree with you.
Professor Pathak, thanks a lot. And we'll try to have you more on board in future, because we want a lot of interdisciplinary dialogues, even in psychology. And a lot of scholars that you talked about, we also teach, like, say, one-dimensional man Marcuse. And I teach a lot of Frankfurt School scholars. And so I was really glad to hear your views. Thank you, Professor Pathak. Shall we now switch over to Professor Tripathi? The poetry of Professor Tripathi is different. We know different kinds of poetry move us. One kind moves you, another kind moves Professor Tripathi. So, Professor Ramacharan Tripathi, are you?
I'm here. Now, Minati, can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Please place your views.
Do you want me to start speaking, or the other questions which you would like to?
No, what we'll do, that we'll first listen to you.
Okay.
Take questions for your part, and then we can open it for both of you. If
okay.
Audience wants, we can continue for a little while. Yeah.
Well, let me begin by saying that it was a treat listening to Professor Abhijit Pathak. What I'm going to speak probably is going to be slightly different from what Professor Pathak spoke about. And that's for a very different reason. I think one reason for that is that I'm a psychologist, so I'm more trained into focusing on micro level processes than on macro level kind of things. The subject also is large. I'm reminded of A.K. Ramanujam writing about, is there an Indian way of thinking? And he began by pointing out that you can focus on is, you can begin talking about Indian, what's Indian, or is there something which is not Indian, and then thinking and so on. We can talk about reflexive pedagogy. And when we talk about reflexive pedagogy, then start asking what's meant by reflexive actually, or the different kinds of pedagogies. We want to relate it, this reflexive pedagogy, to what we are facing right now, the pandemic, and how reflexive pedagogy is appropriate or not so appropriate for what's happening during this period. All of those things I think we can do. What I have done over the many years I have been teaching, and I began teaching in 1963, so I think it's been more than what Professor Abhijit Pathak, I mean, the period is a little longer than Professor Abhijit Pathak's. I use reflexive pedagogy in a different way, so I can talk about that. I also understand reflexive pedagogy in a slightly different manner. It's not something where you reflect on things happening around you, or reflect on a phenomenon which has taken place, but it's more about what's happening here and now. In that sense, I think one would be talking more about experiential learning and what one can learn from the experience taking place within a context. And that has a reason. We talked about that, and Professor Pathak drew our attention to it. Some of the comments which we got also, I think, related to that. We're familiar with different kinds of pedagogies. I think today being the International Day of Education, I think it would be appropriate to talk about that. I remember that when this National Policy of Education was formed some time back, the educationists who were responsible for that talked about a particular kind of pedagogy which we called constructionism. Now, constructionism, as all of you know, has to do more with making use of whatever knowledge a person has, and then trying to make sense of things which are happening based on the knowledge which the person possesses. It's different from the kind of pedagogy that all of us are familiar with or practice, which is a kind of pedagogy which is called, or which has been termed didactic, where you have a teacher and then you have a student. You sit in a class and there is a pravachan which takes place. And that pravachan is responsible for whatever knowledge passes from one mind to another mind. There's a problem, I think, when we talk about constructionism. This we have seen taking place in all kinds of situations. But I'm reminded of the jokes which I'm sure that many of you have heard. Or these are called actually the pahelis, Lal Bhujakkar pahelis. And constructionism does about the same thing. Recall that paheli where there was an elephant, if I remember correctly, which had visited a village during the night, and there were these, he'd left behind, these large marks on the ground. And somebody asked, Can somebody tell me, who made these marks? And Lal Bijakkar said that, well, I know who made these marks, and recall what he said. Lal Bijakkar booch gaye और न पूछे कोई उल्टी चाकी बांध के हिरना कूदा होए. So the only thing which they had seen in the village was a deer, and they hadn't seen an elephant. So the only thing they were able to use to make sense of those marks was that maybe that deer, which visits us very often, may have visited us again, but this time with a different. पैर में चाकी बांध के, बड़ी सी चक्की बांध कर कूदा होगा, तभी उसने जो है ये मार्क किए होंगे. Now, what we're talking about when we're talking about reflexive pedagogy, one of the things which you have to understand is that it's different from reflection, just as I said, because that focuses on what has been, not on what's being experienced right now. A lot of what was being said by Professor Pathak related to what he experienced during the period of his teaching. He was reflecting on that. Now, what Miniti ma'am was talking about was, what do you do with this kind of, what do you do so that you can make your learners make use of reflexive pedagogy so that they can learn from what they're experiencing in the context in which they are placed in right now. They're placed in a particular kind of context. It appears to me that you begin with an experience, which is a concrete kind of experience. That concrete kind of an experience, they can be taken through in various ways. When I taught a course in organizational behavior, and when I taught then about conflict resolution, one of the ways in which I made them experience conflict was by creating a conflict or by creating a situation within the classroom and making them experience that conflict, and then making them reflect on the conflict which they had just experienced. So the learning cycle of reflexive pedagogy begins with a concrete experience that students are taken through. In the next step, they're made to reflect on what that experience was. They share their observations, and they try to make sense of those observations in the light of what they already know, the concepts which are already in place, the theories which are already in place. Whatever knowledge which they have. They will discover that they're able to make sense of it. Whatever concrete experience they had, but perhaps will still be very, very uncertain or somewhat uncertain whether they made the sense in the right way. There still may be things which they don't understand. Based on whatever understanding they have, they practice it. So a conflict resolution class, they would try to actually look for alternatives or alternative ways to resolve a conflict. Enter another kind of a concrete experience and then keep recycling it. Till they have a better understanding of that experience they're looking at. The whole idea here is that based on this, the learners have to become somewhat more aware about themselves. It's in the context of the concrete experiences which they have, the kind of context in which these concrete experiences take place, that they would be able to make sense of things which are happening. Now, what I'm saying here is probably applies only to what happened in a classroom. But I think the same thing probably can be said about events which take place outside the classroom. What we try to do through this kind of pedagogy, reflexive pedagogy, as I said, is not only building self-awareness, but also building awareness of the others. Professor Pathak was talking about compassionate listening. That compassionate listening is not possible unless learners develop awareness of others also. You can communicate or you can talk to other people, but communication can be where you listen to people to understand, or like it used to happen in debates, you listen to people because you want to refute them. Now, if you're listening to people to refute, then no communication is possible. If you are listening to people to understand them, then empathy develops. And that empathy then makes it possible for you to become aware of others. It becomes possible for you to become aware of their emotions. It becomes possible for you to form relationships. At the root of reflexive pedagogy is not only understanding self, but understanding self as a purpose. And that purpose is that you want to understand others better so that you can form relationships with these other people. I say this because generally what happens is, and I think this we know from psychology theories, that our personal identities and our social identities come to be formed using a process which we call differentiation. And in this process, self is always seen as distinct from others. The group you belong to is seen as distinct from others. And it's not only seen as distinct from others, but it's seen as inferior in all kinds of attributes to self. And if it's social identity, then you attribute all kinds of negative attributes to your other group. So it's in this process you find that the other comes to be created. Professor Abhijit Pathak was talking about Gandhi. And in Gandhi's example, you'll recall what he was talking about. Gandhi's approach was to see how this distinction between the self and the other can be erased, how these boundaries can be dissolved between the self and the other. Recall what he said when he was trying to organize all kinds of demonstrations against the British, that he was not against the British people. He was against what they were doing in India, making the Indians slave. Now, this process where you try to another the other is possible only through reflexivity. It's possible when our education creates students who are able to create we space. If they're creating spaces which are only I spaces, which very often happens or has always happened, I would say, in all kinds of societies, you'll always have possibilities of a lot of people getting othered. Reflexive pedagogy should make it possible for us to make people feel that they belong to a society. It should make it possible for people to unfold, if I were to use Sally Gerhardt's words, and not other. And that will be possible if together you're able to create cultural and social spaces which you can share. It would not otherwise be possible. Lastly, let me just say a few words about the pandemic and the kind of questions which got raised by some of you. Yes, we've gone virtual. We're working in the virtual mode. And we know that when we're experiencing, what we're experiencing is not really social reality, because social reality cannot be experienced in virtual mode. It minimizes the kind of teaching which is taking place during this pandemic, of developing any kind of social awareness, because we're not able to interact. We're not even able to see faces. We're not able to share pains and joys of the students. I think Professor Ajit Pathak was talking about, and Shivani was, I'm sure, I'm not sure whether Shivani talked about or somebody else talked about it, but yes, of our students. Our dopamine levels have gone down. What do we do? And it's here again, I think, that we'll have to think about ways in which we can learn to be a little more optimistic than we have been in the past. We know about learned helplessness. There's something called a learned optimism. Now, can we make our students more optimistic than they are in the present times? I feel that we can. One of the things which I did in my class in which I teach behavioral skills is to make my students focus on self-talk, particularly on their negative self-talk. I then asked them, all right, let's focus on understanding what was this adverse event that you faced, about which you think all the time. What are your beliefs associated with this adverse event? And when you think of these adverse events, what kind of negative emotions do you experience? Made them also think about how can these beliefs be disputed. Is there evidence for these beliefs? What is the evidence for the beliefs which you have? Why do you think that they will be pervasive? They will persist? And if they're able to find ways, and we make them think about ways, how they can dispute these beliefs, it becomes possible for them to get re-energized. There are ways in which it can be done. This model, as you would have guessed, is a kind of a model which has been used by psychologists called A, B, C, D, E model. A for adverse events, B for beliefs, C for consequences, D for disputation, and E for energization. I believe that through reflexive pedagogy, it should be possible for us not only to make people more self-aware, more socially aware, but it should be possible for us to improve their well-being. I can keep going, but I'm going to stop here because I just looked that I have taken more time than Minidhi thought that I would be taking. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Tripathi. I think let's take some questions for or comments for Professor Tripathi, and then we'll open it to both the speakers. Anybody has any comment to offer or a question for Professor Tripathi? It's an interaction, you know, you can also give your views, your own experiences. Anybody has any?
They're all tired. They're all tired, it seems.
Yeah, it's getting late, I know. Anybody wants to share his or her experience, but briefly?
Actually, Professor Tripathi, I just wanted to ask one question. I mean, as we discuss or we talk about reflexivity and empathy, can empathy be apolitical? Can we imagine empathy coming from a space of neutrality or being apolitical? Yeah.
I'd like to understand, Shivani, why do you think that empathy can be political in the first place? I don't understand that, because empathy is between, I mean, there has to be, I like to understand a little more about it.
I mean, in terms of if empathy doesn't recognize the pain, the oppression or injustice, I mean, what does it take for me to empathize with the pain? I mean, won't somewhere I also have to recognize what are the structures, that may be responsible, or they may be in some ways affecting how that pain happens. So in that sense, I mean, is it possible? I mean, just wanted to hear from you, and that's where I was coming from.
Well, if I understand, let's say, let's take an example. There's a student who has been deliberately failed because he belongs to a certain caste group, or a teacher. Okay. Now, it was a political act on the part of the teacher. Now, if I empathize with that person, how do I empathize with that person? If I understand that person's pain, I will have to understand not only that person's pain, but also understand, how that happened within a certain context.
True.
Unless I understand that, I will not be able to empathize.
Absolutely.
Now, the other thing which I think is important here is that the idea behind that, if it is about changing that person, if that is what you have, then your act becomes political. If you want this person to see the reality in a particular manner, you say, no, teachers are always right. Or forget this, if this is going to happen, next time the teacher is going to, do this or do that, or fail you again, or whatever else. That's not really going to help. We're talking about empathizing with that person, and empathizing with that person means that this distinction between self and other has to narrow down. If that does not narrow down, then empathy is not possible, or this act of empathizing is not possible.
Can I join this dialogue? I work on multilingual education. That's one area of my research. And one of the arguments we give is that it's not about knowledge only. Like classroom obviously doesn't allow many children's languages and therefore their knowledge systems. It also doesn't allow their affective resources, their intersubjective resources in the classroom. So a classroom that denies affective resources to some cannot also develop a kind of a language to for empathy, for everybody. So I think Shivani probably was trying to refer to this, that when the classroom doesn't allow certain children's, affective resources or their intersubjective experiences or resources in the classroom, we also don't probably develop a language to for empathy. When they talk about their pain, their miseries, we don't know how many times we fail to understand, and therefore we fail to also empathize them. I'll give the example of one of my students' work, Aparna Vyas, who studied this concept called Pida among Dalit women in Uttar Pradesh. And there she was trying to say, there are a couple of things she found out, but one thing she was trying to show that, when some of these Dalit women narrated their life stories, she said that I was not able to enter into their life world. So they were talking about pain. Jab pida bol rahe hain, मैं समझ रहा हूं कि they're talking about their personal pains and the kind of journey they have. But वो pain किस तरह से है, the depth of it I never got, because I still come from a privileged family. I'm a Brahmin. I could never get the depth of that pida. So in a way, she was saying that, look, I was not able, I was getting some sense, yes, they were pained, but I was not getting full of it, because I still am not able to enter into that, lived world, So I think when classroom is political, it's clearly a political space, and it's a discriminatory space. It doesn't allow everybody's knowledge and emotions to come and be part of our dialogue. Then do we have a language for empathy for everybody?
Ma'am, where I was also sorry, I'm so sorry. When Professor Tripathi started, when he said that, from macro, when psychology requires us to also attend to micro. Yeah. So, my question also is coming that from the sense that, if I have to understand agency, it gets negotiated in certain structures. And one of my concerns was coming is like during the time of pandemic, so as a psychologist, how do I respond when one of my student again called up saying that her grandmother had passed away during the second wave of COVID? And she had been, driving her grandmother the entire day to find a hospital where she could find a bed and a ventilator. And when she called in the evening, when the grandmother had passed away, more than grief, there was a lot of anger at herself, because the last place where they found the oxygen cylinder was at a gurdwara. And her guilt was that, why didn't I go to gurdwara first? Now, I didn't know how to tell her. I mean, if somebody falls sick, how do I tell her that, of course you couldn't have thought of the gurdwara first? So, I mean, how would it have been possible for me to empathize with her without realizing or without acknowledging at that point of time that there were certain structures, certain decisions that is happening? Whether one transforms it or not is a different question. But, how important it is to realize that, there was a problem, there was an injustice, or there was something that, was denied before I can attempt and, I can attempt a empathy that would be meaningful for her, or that in some way would reach out to her. So as psychologists, can we, I mean, would that binary of micro macro work in that sense? So that is where, I mean, my question was coming from. Thanks, ma'am, for
Partly your
articulating
first
it.
answer.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's nice. Yeah.
Well,
I was asking about macro binary. Yeah.
Well, let me try to first address this this question which Shivani raised about the student, her student, who called her up about her grandmother or whoever that person was, who was not able to. I mean, the system did not help this particular person at the time at which she needed help. What psychologists generally do is that when I talked about listening, now there is a way, I think, which we teach our students to listen. It isn't where they listen like a common or a lay person. They listen to understand, and when we say they listen to understand, there is a regime which goes with that. We're talking about the interpersonal kind of listening, basically between two persons, and not the kind of listening which Vinithy is talking about, which takes place within a classroom. Okay, that's a different kind of, that's very different. Yes, I think the basic idea here is that this person is trying to make sense of what really she experienced, and she's confused. She's not able to make sense out of that. I mean, it may appear to you that she has already made sense out of whatever she's saying, but no, she has not. And when you listen and you reflect, you try to make sense for her and keep on, helping her to understand, then both of you in that process understand that, yes, injustice has been done, and this could have been prevented. And when both of you understand that, yes, what you're saying, I understand it in exactly the same manner, empathy is present. When you do not understand what she's saying, and you are sort of adding to it or elaborating it, still elaborating, then that possibility probably of understanding goes away. Sushmita, I think, who is a counselor, probably has something to say. So let Sushmita come in.
Before Susmita comes, can I be a Vygotsky for a minute? Just for a minute.
Well, I think your social structure is too much with you.
And I was trying to say...
You're a Vygotsky for life for a minute.
No, what I wanted to say is, like we all have phylogenetic.
On the unfinished legacy of Dr. Amir.
We all have phylogenetically evolved for taking perspectives, multiple perspectives, and understand that people have, your perspective can be different from my perspective. And as a psychologist, I'll say that this is very fundamental. It plays a very fundamental role to develop empathy, Fine. But when Professor Pathak was talking about Marcue's one-dimensional man, and if we read Marcuse very, very carefully, we realize that there is a politics of reducing us to just one dimension, just to one dimension. And that's where we lose our perspectives and think through just one that the world asks us to look at. And that's when, the empathy collapses. So the politics of empathy is also politics of returning this phylogenetically evolved capability to think perspectively. I think our fight is against, this as well. Susmita, sorry, I took a little time from yours. So Susmita, you want to say something? You wrote something.
Yeah, thank you, sir, for giving me this opportunity. And thank you, Professor Sethi, for again listening. The dilemma that I always feel is that when we claim that, yes, I'm trying to understand in using empathy, there's always again a very, somehow I feel there's a glamour in, particularly amongst our practicing counselors, that yes, I am being empathic. And of course, without, but my question is, how can I claim to be truly empathic? Because the subjectivity of my experience, my way of seeing the world, my way of interpreting the experiences of another person is so much colored by my, or when I say my, it is the person, anybody. So to claim that I am truly understanding you or another person's situation, another person's experience, is probably a very hypocritical way of saying. It's a very surface level, because come what may, I feel it's completely my way of saying it's just not possible. And when we claim that this is a skill, this is something but what one can learn and can do, is probably trying to minimize another person's capacity to understand. Why? What is the harm when we say that, okay, fine, I can make an attempt to understand what you are going through? Why do we have to make ourselves tell that I can understand? I am understanding what you are feeling. I can understand what you are saying, when actually I'm not. I cannot understand what you are going through. Just taking from where Shivani is sharing her experience, that she was not, she was finding it very difficult to understand why at that point this girl is feeling guilty that I have not taken, I have not gone to the Gurudwara. That is because Shivani's experience, Shivani's rational thinking, her training in the discipline, her exposure has made her understand what is rational for her. But probably for that girl, there was something which she has learned through her family interactions, through her other social and everything that she has learned over the years, which is making her feel guilty. So there is no, there is no negotiation over here that you are right, I am wrong, or I am right, you are right, or something like that. It is simple that one can only attempt to. I mean, it's very difficult for me to accept that we cannot say that I'm trying to. I am making an attempt to understand, rather than giving a statement or telling one's own self.
I'm a little surprised, at what you're saying, because you teach counseling.
And it is my personal opinion, sir.
Well, I mean, if I'm a little surprised. Sorry for saying that. I do not think that any counselor ever says that I am feeling empathetic or I am empathetic or whatever. There is no claim made by anyone. It's the person, who you're trying to help, who would say that to you. and you will learn from that. If there is a person who's making that tall claim, you're right. I think there is a problem with that person, and the problem is with the training, which this person has received, because this person has not understood what being empathetic means. All right. But there is a problem there. What we're trying to do is we're trying to help this person. And in this process, we're trying to help, understand. And what may have happened, I think I can tell you now, I think that's a problem not only with let's say, other social sciences, it's more with psychologists, because they have learned only through books. The training has been, more didactic. They have not used the reflexive pedagogy at all. They haven't really experienced the pain, which, for example, Miniti ma'am is talking about. The pida which she's talking about, let's say, of the poor people, of the other people, and other kinds of things. Now, if you cannot, place yourself in the position of someone else and experience the pain of that person, then there is no experiential base to your learning. And if there is no experiential base to your learning, you will learn only from the books, then sorry, I think you're going to be a hypocrite. Yes. You're talking about those who have learned from the books, not from the kind of pedagogy which should have been used in the training.
Can I come in, sir?
I don't know. It much depends on Miniti, and we already have going on for some time now. We can discuss it later on.
Professor Tripathi later, isn't it?
Sure.
One or two more comments or questions, and then we'll end this webinar.
Point, Minati.
You can ask questions. Professor Pathak, you want to say something?
May I just add one thing? Such a extraordinarily illuminating and insightful debate that Professor Tripathi and Shibani raised, and all of us repeated. As I was listening to it and learning from it constantly, I tend to feel that, empathy at one level is exceedingly difficult endeavor, but at the same time, that empathy is the only possibility of our shared humanity, the possibility that arouses hope in breaking the wall and a move towards fusion of horizons. And I think that at one level, it's a methodological possibility, which in sociology, people like Max Weber spoke so deeply that empathy is a way of knowing, imagining oneself in the position of the actor and to understand the meaning that the actor is attaching to the world. And that is the way he wrote that entire book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, what it meant to be a Protestant and the Calvinist, and what it meant to live with this worldly asceticism, and how capitalism, as Weber would argue, grew. So that's a methodological possibility. But another, I believe, where I think that there is a possibility where Shivani's point is very interesting. And there I see empathy is not only a political act, but at the same time also a spiritual act. So I would say that more of a politico-spiritual act. And here I see a lot of possibilities in some of our extremely sensitive artists, and literary novelists, poets. And that's why possibly the hermeneutic philosophers often refer to their work. Take, for example, when you read Om Prakash Balmiki's autobiography, Jutan, we understand that he himself passed through it, that what it meant to be a child of a marginalized caste and community, and how a very oppressive forward caste school headmaster behaved with him. So he passed through it. But when we read, for example, Munshi Premchand and writing, portraying the character of Dukhi in his story, And Munshi Premchand didn't experience what it meant to be a Dalit, what it meant to be a marginalized caste, but through and tremendously urge to constantly break the walls of separation he could understand and portray it. And then another forward caste, in so-called forward caste, Satyajit Ray, through the using Om Puri and Smita Patil, could make a film Shadgoti and portray the characters so brilliantly. So in both these, we see a possibility. And it is also, I believe, both a political and ethical act. And that's why possibly because of that power of empathy, we understand why Simone de Beauvoir wrote The Second Sex. But how do you make sense Henrik Ibsen portraying the character of Nora in The Doll's House? Now the extraordinary character of The Doll's House, and then her self-realization, and the way she realizes that throughout her life, she was just existing as a doll at one time of her father and one time of her husband, and then her mode of resistance and coming out of it. And then Ibsen is portraying that. I believe these are the domains of possibilities. Empathy is difficult, exceedingly difficult, but the fact that it is difficult does not mean that you and I are eternally doomed, and you and I would never be able to break the wall of separation. Then we are doomed. Then there is no possibility. We would live in exclusivist pockets. You are a Dalit, I am a Brahmin. You are a woman, I am a man. You are white, I am black. And because of that empathy, I think that possibly a different kind of politics, which would one day transcend the boundaries of exclusivist identities, and think of a new world possible. So the fact that it is difficult, that should not be the reason to negate it altogether, so that's the point.
I want to join that with another dimension.
Let me just add, I think
sure.
Yeah, I think what Professor Pathak said, I think we need to understand it here, because most of us are here either from sociology or psychology or whatever. I think if we do not understand that social sciences tell us how to become a better human being, the challenge is becoming human. That's what social sciences are about. And if that possibility is not there, we're wasting our time.
Yeah. I just want to, since Professor Pathak talked about this spirituality, because we, again, I'm becoming a psychologist. Like, since we can metaphorize, we can use metaphors. We are therefore, we develop, and our life, our experiences help us develop an array of aesthetic, resources. And at the core of it, it is spiritual, but at another level, it's this aesthetic resource, which negotiates between the boundaries. And I completely agree with you. Now, when you talk about spiritual, spiritualism or spirituality, that is sort of mediating. I also see this aesthetic resources mediating hugely between people, between their life worlds, and creating possibilities to understand each other. And therefore, we have been understanding each other, all our, in the entire history of human civilization. And we are a culture, and we are evolving because of that very possibility of, understanding each other. But what I wanted to say then, another thing, which, Frankfurt School scholars said very clearly, that there is therefore a huge politics of controlling these aesthetic resources. our aesthetic resources are not allowed to be played out in full. The moment we are allowed to, we use them adequately, we also start interpreting each other, we start understanding each other, and then we create our own politics. That's what no establishment, no state wants. So I think you're talking using this term spiritual one, they meet because the aesthetic resources at the very core is also spiritual. So therefore I don't see a difference between them, where poetry ends, where spiritual, realm begins, or where aesthetic resources and feelings end and spiritualism begins. At one core, at the core, it's about a beautiful, connection, pattern, which is aestheticism. It has nothing to do with religion, or religiosity. Is that spiritualism, sorry, not aesthetic, spiritualism. So I think that many don't understand. I think what you talked about is extremely fundamental, but people don't understand that very well. What they understand is this aesthetic resource, and which I think we actively control through our, Sasbi Kavi Bhoti, plays its own role in depriving us of our true aesthetic resources, and therefore a kind of spiritual experience. So I think if we come to, like when I was talking about this pida, I'm sorry that because I stopped there, it appeared as if we don't understand each other. But then we don't understand each other with the given, linguistic or experiential resource we have. That's where metaphors work. That's where poetry works. That's where, spiritual, the kind of spiritual, linking, to human lives through their narratives works. So I think I'm so happy with both of you, giving an opportunity to understand how we constantly translate each other, understand each other, and create, enough linguistic, aesthetic, or spiritual resources to break these, politically created boundaries. In fact, the politics is about retaining these boundaries or create more boundaries. And we have enormous psychological, social resources to break those boundaries. And it is so central to reflexive pedagogy, like practicing reflexive pedagogy is probably realizing this. And okay, I don't want to say the last word. Both the speakers can have the privilege to speak the last word. So if you want to say anything, please say, and then we'll end the session.
Ma'am, there is a hand raised by Dr. Ravi Shankar. So I think we can take.
Can we take this one question from Dr. Ravi Shankar? Dr. Ravi Shankar, you can forgive.
Yes, ma'am, I have unmuted.
Yeah. You can also.
Am I audible? Can I begin?
Yeah, please.
I have a query, and my query is to both the speakers and to you also. First of all, I want to contextualize my query by giving a few observations, and I too admit that my observations could be incorrect. The query is about the nature of imagination, our ways of imagining, because imagining is a very integral part of learning, reflection, reflexivity, and all. One of my observation is that most of the observations are from the literary creations. One of the observation is that in present times, we see that these creative writers are not writing, that lengthy novels or lengthy poetries. They are writing mostly 150 pages to 30 pages, where we see that in earlier times, it used to be 400, 500, more than that, to 1,000 pages. So there used to be a details. And also as kids, I remember when we used to read some stories, then we used to visualize and imagine things, imagine situations, imagine situations by applying our imaginative power. Nowadays, we see that there is a lot of technological innovations, audiovisual aids, technological aids. So I wonder if these aids facilitate in the ways of imagining, or the kids today are they have a different way of imagining than the kids in older times. This was my first observation. The second observation is I read somewhere that it is very difficult to translate the work of writers like French Kafka into in the televised form. So it is difficult to translate them in audiovisual ways, and the best of the animated work cannot do justice to the writings of writers like Kafka and most of the writings of magical realism. So this is my second observation. The third observation is the writings, what we call modern classic. I do not know to what extent it will remain as a modern classic. So in these context, I want to understand that have our ways of imagining changed? Have our ways of do these technological audiovisual aids inhibit our ways of imagination, or they have or they are fostering our ways of imagination? Are there continuity in our ways of imagination, or are there ruptures? Is there a shift? What it is? So I would seek request from the speakers to respond to this nature of imagination of present times in comparison to the past. Thank you.
Professor Pathak, Professor Tripathi, would you like to respond to?
Ma'am, could I just add to the query? Like I had a question which was similar. I had an observation.
Okay. Yours will be the last one we take, huh?
Ma'am, can I add it to it? Like
sure. Yes. Please add.
So, like the gentleman was saying about the shift from generation to one idea, I think, which underlies this pedagogy in general, especially in children which are younger than me, like in school, or this idea of gamification very well encapsulates. If you are, I don't know how many of you are aware, this online gaming is becoming very prevalent in the young generation, that people who virtually connect to other people and they create their own incentives within the game world, own rules, own types of ideas, and that allows a side kind of cutoff, if you understand. And what the gentleman was saying, this shift and all the principles you talked about, like ma'am was talking about instrumentalization of that deep learning process, these ideas are becoming possible in that kind of gamification of things we are doing. And technology has this idea of turning everything into internal criticism. If technology has done something wrong, we'll create a new technology, and it doesn't get out of that. So it's that kind of extension which sabotages all the core fundamental ideas which you, Minati ma'am, or Tripathi sir, or Pathak sir were talking about. That technocratic idea is prevailing in our young generation from a very base level. They will not even know how to question it after a point, after say a generation of what we are going through as in those processes. So that was, if they can comment on it or elaborate. So that was.
Thanks. Yes. Professor Pathak, Professor Tripathi, you can please respond to both the commenters. So, yeah.
Okay, let Professor Tripathi begin, then I.
have a very brief reply. I think we all know it, that the imagination has to have certain elements, based on, whatever people have experienced. I mean, they would not be able to use the kind of experiences which they have either, I mean, they have not been a part of, or maybe even in vicarious manner, they haven't experienced those kinds of things, then they cannot be used. Now, what happens in case of the virtual mode is that the real experience is not there. What you have is that actually what is presented to you is in that particular virtual mode, you're expected to engage in your own kind of construction. And it's quite possible that 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different people who are viewing the same, let's say, video, may understand it very differently. It's not necessary that they will construct it in exactly the same manner. They would view it very differently. So I think what we really need to understand is that what is being provided today, there are very few people now who are able to read books like Professor Ajit Pathak did. They probably buy, I mean, they either view videos, or they listen to maybe whatever is there on or read whatever is there on Google or various other platforms. And based on that, I think they're able to construct what they're able to construct. But imagination requires, all kinds of imaginations require some kind of a living experience. And if they don't have that kind of living experience, they will not engage in any kind of imagination that you're talking about. I don't know whether I make sense, but that's what I thought.
Yeah. Now, thank you, Professor Tripathi. You made such a significant point. And I believe that the question, Minati, which has been raised is very important question, and there is no very simple and easy linear answer to this question. But I feel that one thing where I see the genuineness of this question and the concern raised, for example, when social philosopher, Zygmunt Bauman, again and again reflected on an issue of this kind and reminding us of what is happening to our imagination and cultural practice and consciousness in the age of rapid dissemination of informations, symbols, visuals, and messages in the age of internet, in the age of smartphone and the technology and the communication. And he often said that it is often causing certain kind of deathlessness, the cult of instantaneity and the deathlessness. And I think from a similar kind of anxiety, the first question and the articulation came that, everything, that it's no longer just a 5-minute YouTube video. It has to be 30 seconds started, beginning. So Instagram would be like that. Twitter would be 30 words and things of that kind. And that's why from there, I think that anguish comes, that why is it in an age of this kind, the huge master novels, people like Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Tagore wrote, which would become increasingly difficult to find, because of that instantaneity. And so I think I understand that concern. But as someone who believes in the pedagogy of hope and with certain kind of hope in human possibility, I also see, for example, as you said, that whether Kafka's stories could be portrayed today in the film, Definitely Kafka's metamorphosis, that suddenly one fine morning you find yourself as an insect roaming around the world and experiencing completely the anonymity and the absurdity of your life. Now, it cannot be portrayed by Ekta Kapoor. It cannot be done by Karan Johar, but possibly a director like, if these directors are around, Charlie Chaplin or Satyajit Ray and others, possibly, they could use this technology and they could actually portray that experience, that anguish, that intensity which Kafka portrayed in that story, Metamorphosis, and that could be done. So I think that, and imagine that possibly in the coming world, you and I might go beyond Kapil Sharma's show, Ekta Kapoor and Karan Johar, and possibly Minothi's student, your student, someone one day end up becoming another Charlie Chaplin or Sham Benegal or Satyajit Ray, using technology, but doing it with such wonder and beauty. Those of you who have not seen Ray's first film classic of Pather Pacheli,
Yes.
Now there was a shot, and see the power of imagination. In those days of black and white and the minimal technology, that Opu and Durga, brother and sister from the deep forest trees, just camera is focusing on their eyes. That rural girl with full of wonder and innocence and the naughtiness. And their eyes, just look at that eyes, and there was a running train, train is moving around. Train, the symbol of new age, the modernity, the urbanity, the speed that has arrived. And these two children are just looking at it with surprise, wonder, and the curiosity. Just a 30-second shot, and such a beautiful use of that rudimentary technology and camera in the 50s. But today, unfortunately, Karan Johar with his latest technology could not do it, could not make it. Definitely Kapil Sharma could not do it. So I think that it is important for us to evolve, also to evolve our test, to sharpen our test, and as teachers, to tell these stories to our young students that writing is not Twitter 350 or 150 expression, and photography is not selfie. There is something more into it. Then possibly technology could be used much more meaningfully and deeply. How we use technology, that needs another kind of pedagogy, that needs another kind of education. So you give a smartphone to the student, to the class 10 student, but there ought to be some teacher to tell that whether through that smartphone in the internet, he sees a beautiful film, reads a beautiful story, or he watches pornography. So, and that is where the importance of education lies, how we live with technology, engage with technology.
I just want to say one small thing, being a psychologist. This technology is wiring us a little differently. But then, what I see with my son is doing masters now. And so I interact with a lot of his friends. And what I see is that because of this technology, a lot of old and original movies, fictions, poetry are now available. Not that people are not reading. I see many people who would otherwise not read because they don't have access to these, now have started reading because they have access to read. What we need probably is to create a kind of stress, kind of tension in the existing practice. And that's where the pedagogy comes in. That's where education comes in. We have to do something because we'll be tired of this 30-second firing, intense firing of our brain. How long can we continue? We will evolve. I know that now technology is playing very heavily on us. And you read Adorno's book, Mass Culture. Even there is a chapter on technology and mind in One-Dimensional Man, I think 3rd or 4th chapter, brilliantly written. And these were written in 1960s, which basically told us what we are discussing now, as if it is written today during this pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic. So what I'm saying that, yes, it is terribly worrisome, because it is wiring our brain, our tastes, our desires in a particular way. But know that, this wiring of desire is done in a far broader political space. It's not only technology. Technology is part of this larger political narrative, and many more things are pitching into, sort of mobilize our desires to want something. But it cannot stay like this always. We'll be tired. So I say 2 possibilities. One, we will get tired, but we'll not wait for human beings to be tired one day and they say, no, we want to go back to forest and live our old life. We also have to intervene through our education, through our pedagogy, to create, to disturb these kinds of, marginalization of desires, which are counterproductive, which we are not able to appreciate. And that's one. Second, I also see that no, there are people who are reading classics today because these are available now to everybody. So it's the same internet, which is, playing havoc with our mind and culture, is also creating affordances of this kind. So I'll join Professor Pathak saying that no, there is a text of hope. But then that can remain alive only if we teachers know, at least we have, we have an agenda in our hand. As I said, students spend 3 hours with us. What can be more powerful? They may not be spending 3 hours in front of TV every day, but they spend 3 hours with teachers. If teachers know what to do, we can do. Of course, teachers are also, controlled. Their lives are also controlled. Anyway, Professor Pathak, it was brilliant to listen to both of you, and also the audience, all our, everybody in the audience was thinking and was contributing to this dialogue. It's brilliant. Thank you. And we will see if we can get back on a theme like this again in now, because it's absolutely fantastic to talk about our lives,
And I also thank you, ma'am, for choosing such a theme in these times where it becomes so much relevant, and for organizing this webinar. And you can see, creating a dialogical space for talking about reflexive pedagogy. We can see in the chat box, I think it's brimming with, the conversation about what kind of the teachers' experiences, the kind of pedagogy they want to practice. So it was really wonderful.
Unmute. Yeah. It's muted by mistake.
It was really a wonderful session, so profoundly insightful, and a treat for me, and I'm sure others as well. Thank you, speakers. Thank you, Vinti ma'am, and thank you, everyone. Ma'am, over to you.
Oh no,
okay.
You have concluded.
Okay.
Thank you, Minati. Thank you, Professor Tripathi. Nice listening to meeting you.
Thank you, Professor Pathak. Thank you, Minati, and thank you, Nikita.
Thank you.
And I
thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Okay, stay safe and take care. All the best.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you. Vijit, I'll get back to you more. I'll trouble you. Now that you have superannuated, you are our teacher. You are everybody's teacher, So you'll speak more in our forums.